think it's very important that right from the very outset of the lesson, that the teacher gets the child involved. The whole business of online learning is not about conducting 7 or 8 lectures for the child per day. They cannot take that level of being talked at in a normal lesson, and now they're online, their eyes are tired, their ears are even tireder. So the last thing they need is for the teacher to adopt the lecture approach. So there needs to be a good sharp starter for the lesson, something that gets the child definitely involved. There is no reason why material cannot be sent to a child before the lesson. So if, for example, there is to be material that's used for reading, then the child should be sent that in advance of the lesson with the request that that is at least read over and perhaps understood before the lesson has started. Then it means that there's much more in the way of a student's engagement with the material, with the topic during the lesson. As well as that, the teacher can use pictures, they can use a number of devices that can be used as well. It could be an artifact or something that the child is shown. Again, if it's a picture, send them their own copy in advance so that they can see it more clearly or on their own device. And that can be used as well to create some interest. But the most important thing for me is that the material has to be interesting and it has to be connected to the child's own background. Now this can be at any time, at any lesson, in any place. If it is too cerebral, then the child is not actually really cognitively engaged with the whole thing. So a teacher needs to apply it to a real world setting. So if you're going to be talking about interest rates, for example, make it look like it could be something like the child is going to buy something like a car when they get older. You know, how much interest are they actually going to be paying on it? Or better still, get them to actually look at the interest on house mortgage and make sure they never buy one. There's all sorts of things that can make it very interesting. The children will remember an interesting lesson and an interesting delivery long after the lesson has actually gone. And that's what learning is about. Learning is about remembering stuff after it is actually gone. If you look at Dale's pyramid of experience, you will find that a child that is taught to learns only 5% of the material. 30 days later, only 5% has been retained. So lecturing is out. Copying doesn't even figure. If the children read something, it only goes up to about 10%. If you are getting them to do something or to interact with the material, then it goes up to 75–80%. Particularly if you get the child to actually teach you in return. Well, you've learned that material, now teach me this material. I want to imagine that I know nothing about it, you teach me. The learning then goes up to 95%. So it is important. We do not want passive learning. We want active learning, active students involved in the lesson. Okay. The first and most important thing to remember is that some children have been highly dependent on their teacher in school. So if they want reinforcement of an activity or an exercise that they've done, they've been able to put their hand in the air, the teacher comes over to them, confirms that what they've done is correct, and then they can move on with the next. They have had that removed. Back in March, when online learning happened very suddenly, this dependence was simply not possible. So they reached for the next most important person around. It was their parent, and the adult, if you like, has become this de facto person to go to. That, I think, is one of the good aspects of online learning, is I really hope this dependence on teachers has actually been withdrawn somewhat. Children learn to think for themselves. But there has most definitely been some problems with students who don't cope well with the fact that they can be, you know, online looking at a screen in a computer for maybe somewhere between 5 to 7 hours. That's never been known as very healthy. And people like Professor Susan Greenfield from Oxford University was talking about the effects of gamification and the use of computers and technology on children and the release of dopamine into the brain. But there's also another effect as well, and that is simply online fatigue. You know, they simply cannot. Part of it is to do with what I talked about on the last question, and that was to do with they do not react well to being lectured at for long periods of time. And if this is the case and they're not actively involved in the lesson, it's not actually connecting with them in a direct and personal way, then they are going to become very, very weary very, very quickly. And they will demonstrate that in a number of ways. One of the most important ways they'll do it is that they will just simply withdraw. They will say they don't want to do something. Or they will have headaches, is another issue. If they're working late at night on something and it involves screen activity, then they don't sleep very well either. And of course, children need far more sleep than they're getting in most parts of the world at the best of times. They certainly do not need to have interrupted sleep at the moment. So 8 hours is around about the minimum amount of sleep that a child should have. But they're simply, we know this is not actually happening. And screen time and screen overuse is one of the reasons for it. So they will withdraw, or else they will say that they have actually completed activities when in fact they haven't. So this is kind of like denial of the fact that the work is building up the requests from their school are actually due. They may be overdue, but they just simply cannot cope with it. So the easiest way to actually not cope with it is to say, right, well, I've done it. It's denial, it's called. Okay, so
do you think that the kids, their relationships between the siblings change?
Not necessarily, although I think one of the impacts of this is going to be that children are working in isolation. But this has been an impact. I mean, Baroness Greenfield actually mentioned that this was going to be an impact as well. And that is the fact that with gamification, you sit with your own device on your own. This is a fact for the future, that we are going to have children who are much more isolated in the activities they do. It's simply the nature of technology. I mentioned in my answer to the last question that the dependence that some children had on teachers has now been deflected and moved towards the adults or to older siblings. Yes. And parents not knowing how to get around that role and concerned maybe that their children were going to be moved immediately online to something completely different, have, if you like, adopted a very hands-on approach to the learning of their children, where they are actually sitting alongside them for many hours a day. Now, that has the same effect of a teacher who's actually allowing the child, if you like, to get the answers from them all the time, for this constant reinforcement. Children who are homeschooled, for example, do not need to have, and it's not advised that they have their parent sitting alongside them all the time. Right. You want the children to be able to think for themselves. They do not know everything. That's the whole nature of childhood, is that you don't know the answer to everything. And you're not going to get it immediately. It may be that there has to be some, cognitive activity that goes on from the child's end in order to reason and to work things out. And that's why I quite like an activity that I call Connect, where it could be numbers, words and pictures, where the children actually have to think about a way of connecting those pictures together. But they have to do the thinking. Now, if they have been used to being with a teacher who gave them the answers to things all the time, or a parent who swoops in and says, well, how about you do it this way, and shows them how to do it, you are removing immediately any need for the child to think. And, they will become quite used to this quite quickly. So they think, right, I need the answer in the shortest possible time, so I will go to my parent and I will get it. The other thing that is most important to stress is that parents need to be much more hands-off when it comes to the business of the completion of work and also to do with assessment. The parent should, if there's an assessment activity going on, the parent must be nowhere near the child and make sure that the child actually knows that. Because schools are rightfully very concerned about who's turning in the work. Is this actually really the child's work, or is this somebody else's work? And, you know, they know this because they're seeing that the quality of work that's coming in is a step up from what there was prior to the children's going on to distance learning. And it will become very obvious when they go back to school, if the parent has had too much of a hands-on for it, then it's going to mean that the child's work is going to take a serious step back. So my advice to the parents is to actually make it very clear to the child that this is your period of learning. They set aside a quiet place free of distraction, so no TV in the corner, no ability to have games or anything else that are played during the game. If you have this together with good interactive lessons, good active learning on the part of the child, then you will actually have children who are doing and thinking for themselves. That is the most important thing. All the parent needs to really do is to check in and say, right, is everything okay? Let's have a look at, you know, your Google Classroom, or to see what the teacher has sent home. Has that all been completed? Yes, it has. Well, that's actually good. But also, parents need to make sure that they give their children sufficient breaks during the day. So it's not constant feeding, absolutely not, we don't need that, but they need to make sure that they have good hydration, so water is very important as well, but frequent checks to move around and to rest their eyes is also particularly important.
Thank you very much.